Well, I must admit I've never been a moderator before, but I was asked to do this by the mayor of Napa, so it's going to be pretty hard to say no. So hopefully we do a reasonably good job. Both thought I should try to act like Johnny Carson. I do remember Johnny Carson. I've got gray hair. You guys probably think, well, of course you do, knucklehead. But anyhow, so I'll do my best. I thought maybe I'd be better at Ed McMahon, but I probably need to grow a little bit more. Um, but this is fun. The one thing that I wanted to make sure that I said to Bo, and in front of you, I'm just going to say at the beginning so I make sure I don't forget, is thank you. Um, Thank you for sticking it out with your family business for 50 years. That's pretty cool. Uh, Congratulations. Yeah.
Likewise.
No, that I'll spare you the details. He's going to tell us all about his family and their business and their trials and tribulations. We're not going to talk about mine, but I will tell you it's not necessarily easy to do that, right? And so it's an honor to be here with you because I know that you've had to fight pretty hard to do what you do, and we all appreciate it very, very much. Let's see. I also just want to say it's an honor to have an opportunity to be here. I'm feeling, I guess, a little bit nostalgic, a little bit not hysterical, but historical. It's crazy. I will tell you to be the kind of caregiver or the proprietor of a business that's 50 years old, to manage a property that is over 100 years old, to be connected with the people that started it, historically, the historical figures that were involved, to be connected to all these people that are presently involved, and then to be thinking about the future. To be thinking about how does all this go into the future. And we're fortunate that so many steps have been taken by our predecessors, and I guess to some degree by some of us now, that the future is bright. I saw one quote that Bo had on the screen. I can't remember what the exact quote was, but I think it was effectively, "The future is bright," and I believe that. I absolutely believe that, and I think you guys do as well. So thank you. So we're thinking about where we are now. We're thinking about where we're going, but I thought a better place to start, at least with our conversation today, is where were we when we started? Where were we in 1972? So maybe that's a good place to start with, Bo. Give us a sense for what Calistoga, what Napa Valley looked like in 1972 when you first arrived.
Yeah, I grew up at the beach in Southern California. I moved here when I was 18. I'd grown up in a town called Lunada Bay, which is Palos Verdes, and I got up here, and it's a completely different world. I basically grew up a block from the ocean. I was one of those ocean kids. My whole Huck Finn days were in Lunada Bay, snorkeling, surfing, all that. So I got to Calistoga, kind of confused. My father was an attorney in Southern California, and I had graduated from high school, and he said I had to get a job. And I said, what? I want to surf, man. I just finished high school. So he said, no, yeah, this family, my grandparents were Irish immigrants. So he says, you have to have a full-time job or be a full-time student. And I was one of those students that spent the whole time in high school looking out the window, wishing I wasn't inside the building. And so I got to Calistoga, and I actually started working in the vineyard for a guy named John Roleri. And John Roleri was our first vineyard manager. He had plowed grapes from Madame de Pins with a mule. So he was a super experienced Napa Valley grower. And I got to meet him, and he actually took me under his wing and started teaching me how to grow grapes. And I had no idea. My other grandparents was a Norwegian immigrant, so I had no idea when I grew up that I had the crazy Norwegian farmer gene, that I would do anything to stay outside of a building and work outside, even work in farming for $1 an hour when I could have been pouring concrete for $7 an hour. So it's one of those. But yeah, Calistoga, it was very really small, sleepy little town. The big industry in town was the walnut factory, the walnut plant down on Washington Street, where basically the industry was walnuts, and basically everybody delivered their grapes to the co-op in those days, the Gallo Co-op, just down where Hall is now. So most of the grapes were going down there. We got the chateau, and it had been really abandoned for the family. Yort Frank Wing had bought the 16 acres that has the chateau. And we still have the ad. If you come up to Chateau Montelena in our history room on our history placards, we have the ad from the San Francisco Chronicle in 1968 where the chateau is for sale. They have a picture of it that says useful as a spa, as a retreat house, a hospitality, and not a single word about a winery. And so, but a local businessman, Lee Passage, had bought the chateau from Yort Frank Wing and put it together with 100 acres of the vineyard. And the vineyard was really run down. It had all the Prohibition varieties. Before they invented Thompson seedless, there was the grapes out here that they used for bulk, nasty, fortified wines. Actually, I have to go back a little bit. Is it okay to talk about the history? Okay. All right. So
I think that's why we're here. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so the first California wine boom is after the gold rush, right? Everybody knows, so Gustav Niebaum, Alfred Tubbs, they all started those wineries in the 1890s. The Krugs, of course, the Krugs and the Schrams that started, they were the farmers. And then the first group of tycoons to move in were like Alfred Tubbs and Gustav Niebaum, where they started building, Farniente and Christian Brothers and Chateau Montelena. So that was really that we see now in the 90s and 2000s, where the tycoons are coming in with billions of dollars and we have to compete with them. That's actually a historical thing, because Chateau Montelena was founded by an outside tycoon. Alfred Tubbs had a rope factory in San Francisco. Gustav Niebaum's a sea captain, and so these guys moved in. So that's the first American wine boom. Is really Napa and Sonoma takes off, whether it's Zellerbach or John Daniel's estate and all that kind of stuff. That gets going. And then they get put out of business by Prohibition. So it was very successful. A lot of wineries with the history like Schramsberg and ours go back. You can see the awards that they got in the pre-Prohibition. The wines were outstanding. So then they have Prohibition. And the second California wine boom is after World War II. It's the age of industrial winemaking, where the center of American winemaking moves to the Central Valley. And all California wines are essentially fortified and pretty not very good products. If you look in the historical records, the chemical makeup of these wines is appallingly atrocious, and they're all fortified and they're all sweet. And so that's the second wine boom in California. That starts to phase out in 1966, early 60s, when the Gallos need credit for starting the American quality revolution, because they move away from Thompson seedless and the nasty grapes into a quality, into varietals, and that's where they start making the really great Gallo Hardy Burgundy of the 60s, was basically from the co-op here. So then the technology starts leaking out of the Gallos, where they have the 6 PhDs, where it's Brad Webb at Freemark or Jerry Looper for Chateau Montelena later. So the technology, so by 1968, when Davies starts his winery, then the quality revolution is quietly going on in California. And that's the beginning of the third wine boom, which is where it moves back to Napa Valley. So that's the boom that you and I have lived through. It's the 1972 to present is the third wine boom, where we actually get over Prohibition, and California and Napa Valley and the North Coast goes back to center of American winemaking, moves back to Napa Valley from Modesto and to the North Coast, let's say, because Sonoma is important too. And that's how really the three big waves of California wine have taken place.
Well, it's interesting to think, you go back to the early 70s, Riesling still, effectively the predominantly planted variety in Napa. It changed really, really, really quickly. Some of that dates back to the 1800s and these Germans that, the farmers you alluded to that would have started with those other varietals. I think people are interested in that. They might also be interested in knowing what surf spots you found, though. The Southern California guy. I mean, some of us may still feel like we're young enough to go out there and hop on a board. So where should we go? And has that changed? Has that aspect of our lives up here in Northern California changed?
I think that I really did quit surfing. I later worked in the vineyard for summer and fall. I saved enough money. I actually became a skier, and I skied 4 winters at Snowbird before I went to Fresno State. But what I was going back to with the varieties. So the varieties when we got to Montelena were things like Sauvignon Vert and Burger. and these weird varieties. Basically, they were sugar bags of water. They were very bad grapes. And that's what was at Chateau when we got there. There was a little bit of Alicante Boucher, a little bit of Mourvèdre, some Petit Sapettes, and some Zinfandel. But the rest of it was all this weird stuff, So we had to, basically had to do the whole vineyard had to be replanted. There was not a single plant of Cabernet on the property. And so we knew at that time, because remember in the late 60s, Robert Mondavi isn't successful and they're doing great with their cab. BV at the time, the Georges Latour is pretty famous too. So the bet that the class of 72 is making, whether it's us or Claude Duval or, Phelps and those guys making that bet on Cabernet was not that risky of a bet because we had a pretty good success. Louis Martini's the first winery after Prohibition. I think this is important historically too. When people object to tourism in Napa Valley, the first winery built after Prohibition had, guess what? A visitor center. Yeah, it's true. And Robert Mondavi, look at that one, the first really big one built after Prohibition. What was it built around? A visitor center. So people objecting to visitors in Napa Valley, they're just full of crap.
No,
but that's besides the point. Remember that Norwegian farmer thing? That's still sticks.
So the Norwegian farmer, everyone's going to cut him a little bit of slack. We'll just cut him a little slack. But it's interesting, actually, on that point. As I was thinking of the Historical Society, and there was a proclamation that I think there were 23,000 guests or something to that effect this last year, and that was a good thing, right? Because more people then knew about the Historical Society, and then more people could participate in the Historical Society and think of historical Napa. Absolutely, the wineries we need guests too, and I don't know the exact number of visitors that you might have at Montelena, but it's probably not too much different than what we have. And over the course of the year, it's about that same number for a winery like Schramsberg, or potentially for a winery like Montelena. Well, let's go back to I think one of the things that people may know, but in the '60s, it was Riesling, it was Berger, it was Palomino, it was Chenin Blanc, but it was Chablis, right? It was Burgundy. Those are things that we talked about, Hardy Burgundy, but virtually all of the 20 wineries that were in operation, in the 60s and maybe by 72, I don't know if there were 40, obviously with 6 that came in that year. But these new wineries were looking to do something other than Chablis and Burgundy, and so your father and that generation get a lot of credit for seeing the potential that was so quickly realized with that 76 tasting of Paris.
I think this is where the Californians really go off of the French model, where instead of naming our wines after our villages, which is what you grow there, like whether you call it Burgundy or Saint-Emilion or something like that, where we go to the grape cultivar, where we name them Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, Cabernet, that type of thing. That was really, it is to a great degree an American invention, that we really started that. And you see it. So then you got to remember that with the Paris tasting, the Californian success, the Australians kind of modeled their growth of their business, or the Chileans, or everybody else looking at us and said, if the Americans can do it, we can do it too. So, but that was where really, if you go back, like Hugh said, prior to really 1972, there was only a few wines were labeled. Like the Georges Latour Private Reserve was its primary label. It wasn't Cabernet Sauvignon Georges Latour. It was Charles Krug. I forget what it was called, Vintner Select or whatever the Krug one was that Pete was making at that time, and Robert Mondavi Private Reserve. So it wasn't. It came later. Really, it is an American, a big splash onto the world history of wine, where the varietal becomes so important. And so, but the bet was good. And the thing that I'd like to mention is that how welcoming the Napa Valley existing wineries were, whether it was the Raymonds that had owned Behringer, they'd started Raymond. And when we were borrowing stuff, that like a labeler and a filler and a backhoe or a dump truck or something like that, we could actually call down to these, like the Raymonds. I know that, remember, I'm just the lowest level cellar worker or vineyard worker, so my job is to be the gopher. Go down to Raymond and get the labeler, or go over here and get a filler. And the most amazing thing, that looking at it from a historical perspective, is how much they welcomed your folks and, John and Janet Trefethen and stuff like that, like the establishment here was very excited to have the young blood coming in. My folks were young, your folks were young, and they're starting these wineries, and these old ghost wineries are getting relaunched, and how welcoming the existing wineries were. This is an unknown fact, but so Lee Passage had put Chateau Montelena back together. Montelena's trademarks have been sold in the 30s auction, the Char and Towel auction when they went belly up. The Bank of Italy foreclosed, and they sold everything they had, and that included the trademarks. Well, it went to, I wasn't Martini, I forget what they called Freemark Abbey. It was one of those Italian guys, and he goes belly up. So Chateau Montelena's trademark ends up at Bob Trincaro's. And Lee Passage goes up to Bob Trincaro and goes, hey, can I have the trademark for Chateau Montelena back? He goes, oh, yeah, it belongs to you. Yeah, here it is, free, no problem. It's like, so that's, that was the example set to us when we got here of how you're going to treat your people in the same league as you. So us trading stuff to Sterling or getting stuff from Sterling or Schramme, like our famous baseball league, he's a little bit younger. We had this amazing softball league where Schramsberg was in there and Sterling, and it was just an amazing softball league. We had a ton of fun with that. But the point is that we had good examples of being welcoming to that. So whether it was, Walt and Roy Raymond or, those kind of guys, or Bob Trincaro, that was the example that was set for the new people to come in to, they encouraged us. And how we started the Vintners when it was not Valley Vintners, it was a drinking club at Lodi Lane. And then, it seriously was. And then they decided to become a trade organization, and now look at the Vintners now.
There's a great quote that my dad would there are all these things that I remember that my dad would have said. Some of them he said many times, right? But he had this great quote from Robert Mondavi, and one of the the moments in our history that very first year was that we did not have Chardonnay, but we needed Chardonnay to make a Blanc de Blanc, right? You can't make a Blanc de Blanc without the Chardonnay. So we needed the Chardonnay. And so my dad was able to get an agreement with Robert Mondavi, all right? Robert Mondavi said, you're a little crazier than I am, Jack, so I'm going to try to help you. If you succeed, we'll all succeed, right? And then he was able to arrange to have the Chardonnay wine made at Robert Mondavi. He traded them Riesling grapes because it's pretty easy to get Riesling grapes. And then by the time the harvest came around in '65, Robert and Peter had split apart. And so that Chardonnay wine still hadn't been made at Charles Krug Winery, which was the plan. And that was how we were going to make our first Blanc de Blanc. So my dad goes down to Charles Krug, and he had never met Peter, but he finds Peter. And he said, Peter, I know, I've heard that you and your brother are, it's not going so well right now. But I did make this arrangement with your brother that I would bring these Riesling grapes to you, and then you guys were going to make a little bit of Chardonnay for me, low alcohols for my sparkling wine. And Peter said, if Robert said that's what we'll do, that's what we'll do. Yeah. And just like that, right? There still is, I believe, very strongly that spirit in this community, our industry community, of supporting one another, and that thought, hey, if you succeed, yeah, we'll all succeed. And it's pretty cool to be a part of. Bo, let's transition a little bit as we think here. So leaving, I guess, what are some of those key moments that take us from the early '70s to through the early '70s? What are some of those key moments, maybe leading up to that Paris tasting and how that happened?
I think the key moments are leading up to Paris tasting. How I look at it is, as I said, now when the new winery started and they had the chillers and the refrigeration and the people available too, because now from 66 through 72, the technology of modern winemaking has taken place with refrigeration and better equipment, better harvesting, that's been the big revolution that I've seen, is like how we harvest grapes now to then. But you got to remember, we were coming from post-industrial winemaking, which is all batch size and go as fast as you can, to these handcrafted wines. So I think it was the development of handcrafted wines really starting about 1968 with Zellerbach and through your folks, Stony Hill. That type of thing is the modeling for the newer wineries that are starting up. So we're not going to go so much into these we're going to make wine as fast as we can and as cheap as we can. And so the development of artisanal wines as a concept is really in the 70s. And so then when we get the right equipment, the chillers and stuff like that, because these wineries are brand new, so we've learned from Barrett and Mondavi that you got to have chillers to make good wine, right? So we start doing that. So all the pieces are in place. So the quality is there of the wine. The wines are being recognized in California. Sales are good in Northern California and Southern California, and Californians are starting to drink Napa Valley wines. So it's pretty good, but trying to sell it outside of the place. So really the pivotal moment, I do have to give credit to the Paris tasting where it said, oh, the Californians are actually making something special, because that was basically how I look at it, is that we had all the pieces in place. In other words, the compound is ready to go, and all you need is that catalyst, that one drop to go boom, and then the reaction, the chain reaction starts off. So I do think that was a lucky shot and a lucky day, that we had the two wines in the right place at the right time, and that really got us to be able to sell the wines to the rest of the country. So I think that was a pivotal thing, because we were all kind of scraping along with our wine clubs and selling in California, but we'd go to Washington D.C. or New York, and now California wine, a long history of that stuff from the fortified wines from the Valley, really California had a not good reputation for quality. And all of a sudden it did. And that was one. And I think that as we got in, I think another pivotal thing was the 76, 77 drought, where by that time the Israelis had invented drip irrigation. And that was a pivotal thing. So it kind of goes back and forth. For me, I look at the fundamental structure of how things got built, the equipment we got, and the invention of drip irrigation, I think, was really important for the hillsides, because that's when you see the hillsides come up, whether it's all Howell Mountain or Mount Veeder and all that. And, Spring Mountain really never needed water because it's named Spring Mountain for a reason. But the rest of the mountains around here, you really had to have irrigation. So you don't see the vineyards leave the valley floor till like the mid 70s, because now we've got drip irrigation. And then, of course, after the 87, 88 drought, that's where you start seeing drip irrigation come to the valley floor, when we started dealing with the droughty conditions. So for my looking at it is from the success of the vineyards is what drives our entire business. Is like, if we can get the great grapes, the right grape in the right place, and grow it properly, then the wineries are going to be successful after. So I do look at the farming side as a lot of the critical components rather than the PR side. That I really think that what drove the success of Napa is the brilliant light and the land and the weather.
Yeah, we're obviously so blessed to have the range of soils, the real depth of soil conditions that you can find here in Napa, and we'll say more broadly throughout the North Coast. It can't get much better. That diversity is so strong. If you go to a place like Champaign, which is basically the size of Napa, Sonoma, Mendo, all put together, right? It's a much more homogeneous kind of region. And granted, they all make bottle fermented sparkling wine from Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Meunier. In this region of the broader North Coast, wow, you can do that, but you can do Cabernet, you can do all the supporting Cabernet varietals. Heck, we could explore the Italian better if we wanted to. You can do the Burgundian varietals, the Rhone varietals. It's an exciting place to work. And people realize that. I think it's interesting. In my mind, I can always hear, again, back to my parents, it was one thing to figure out how to make the wine. They were absolutely focused and determined to make that wine, and they felt like they did, right? Within a couple of years, right? There was like, we're already there. We've already got the wine that can rival the best in the world. But it sure did help to have that Paris tasting come through and then lift that notion, not only for the local population here, but obviously the national and to some degree international. How was it that particular tasting, which wasn't attended by a gazillion people, how did that particular tasting get so famous?
I think that it was in Time magazine. It was not the cover story. There's the West Point cheating scandals on the cover of that one. But I think it was Time magazine, if you have to remember how important the press was. And it was also, you have to remember how tough it was in the U.S. Remember the Vietnam War is going on. This is 76. It's, kind of right after Vietnam. America, like any good news is good. It's the American bicentennial. So I think it was a part of a. Everybody wanted something to feel good about America about, and I think it was like, yeah, let's go. We actually could do something good rather than having riots and fighting and tearing each other down. Like this is pretty cool. I think that the people were ready for it. And one thing we would talk about, the pivotal thing, is that he didn't give his parents the credit. So Jack Davies, his dad, if you think about Napa Valley, you guys are all old enough to remember how Sassoon's been developed. And, I've been flying. I've been a pilot since 1974. Before that, I flew with my dad over California. I know how much California cities have grown. I've seen it for my, 50 years of flying career. But when the famous, where the backstopper sign is Welcome Napa Valley is down there by Robert Mondavi, that was going to be a 40-acre subdivision. So famous Tokelon Vineyard was going to be a 40-acre subdivision. That was going to start the invasion of the urbanization of Napa Valley. And his folks and a couple other, I'd say Bolsheviks, but forward thinkers, started this thing called UNVA, which was generally detested by a lot of people. And they're the ones that got the Napa Valley Ag Preserve, the first ag preserve in the country. It might even be the world done. I know in Austria they have quite a bit of it, but to have something to preserve the ag. So when you go back to the history of Napa Valley, that we managed not to turn into San Jose or San Carlos or Livermore or something like that, his folks and the people that had the foresight to do the ag preserve, that cannot be understated how important that was, where those of us that are farmers, we are forced to make money making great wines. It's, you can't build, like Mike said, you can't build condos there. So the thing that we had, was it good or bad? So your arm is twisted. Oh, I can't make good wine. I'm lousy at it. I'm going to put in 80 homes on this nice piece of ground with good water. So I think that, getting that little bit of poke in the rear with a sharp stick kind of helped us too.
Well, we want to thank the ultimately the Board of Supervisors of '68. That was the year that was passed, and all 5 of them voted to pass the ordinance. Unbelievable, and it wasn't that everybody in the community liked the idea. People like names like Carpi, who had been around for a while, names like Martini, who had been around for a while, they supported it, right? But it was something that some of the younger upstarts also thought was a good idea, and so they came together. One other aspect of that, obviously, we have the watershed zoning. It's kind of crazy. I mean, Napa County is some would say heavily regulated, right? All right. So that there are pluses to that. Some would say there are minuses to that, but no doubt, you go up in the sky, you look down, or if you just drive down the Napa Valley and you see vineyards between St. Helena and Napa, largely that's what you got. And for that matter, between St. Helena and Calistoga, that's the ag preserve. That valley floor is 40-acre minimum parcel sizes, and it initially was only 20, and then later in the early 70s became 40. Another aspect of that, in the UNVA group that you mentioned was key, was there was an extension of the freeway network that was going to come right through Napa and go all the way through Nice Valley and Alexander Valley. Crazy, right? What if that really did happen? What if that happened 50 years ago? Around 72. I think it was 71, 72. It was right in there when that was a big issue in this community. Maybe the Paris tasting doesn't even happen, right? I mean, that was a little later. Fortunately, those pieces, those building blocks, and we're thankful for people like your parents, my parents, those predecessors. They're those people who did that work. They're not in the room. Right? They're not in the room anymore. That much time has passed. Well, let's jump a little bit further along here. We talked about irrigation methods. We talked about winemaking methods that helped us get that much better. What have you seen relative to the vineyards and like where things might grow? In my mind, a a lot has happened in that regard. There was a time when we made Chablis and Burgundy more than anything else, and it didn't matter what the variety was. We made white wine, we made red wine, we made champagne, right? We could make sparkling wine. But then we started to move into that varietal world that you've talked about. But it seems like since the 70s, we've figured out a lot about where that varietal does well. And that other varietal does well. How did that happen? How did we, as a group, kind of figure that out, sort that out?
I think it's the natural progress that not having the 100 years of experience, where we, a lot by the time our mom and dad got here, that a lot of the historical knowledge of what was going to grow the great growing regions of Calistoga, like I said, we were lucky enough to have John Roleri, so a bunch of the old timers were still around that knew that it's going to be red grapes up north and the white grapes in the south. And so looking at the general, and also at the time there was the mistake in UC Davis, the old Winkler one with the regional zones, zone 1, zone 5, and all the hot stuff, for Calistoga being the farthest north was the hottest area of Napa Valley, and everybody knows now that's not true, but it's back to anyway, it doesn't matter. So but they were taking these, I would say in the proper agricultural term for it, as a WAG. It's a wild ass guess what'll do good here. And so they would wag it and say, or what's selling. Remember, okay, in the American wine market, what happens is Americans don't drink wine, right? Because Americans like sweet. This is an important part of our history. Prohibition taught Americans to drink whiskey or spirits and beer, because you can make those anywhere. You can drag your still wherever you can make beer. You can make beer. You can drag your grain, but you can only make grapes one place. So the only thing Prohibition does is kill the American wine industry. So, but then it teaches 2 generations, almost 3, of Americans to drink 7 and 7 and Jack and Coke and Bud Light, or not even Bud Light, but Miller High Life. So the whole thing is Americans don't drink wine. So then, as the greatest generation guys start getting older, and not even the boomers, but the greatest generation, they go to their doctor, they put on some weight, and the doctor says, you got to drink something. You can't drink 7 and 7 anymore. You got to switch something else. Well, I'm not going to quit drinking. What the doctor says, well, drink wine. It's better for you. Okay, so the Americans that like sweet start drinking wine. And so who's in the right place at the right time is Bob Trincaro, Sutter Home White Zin. Way you go. It's sweet. It's light. It's good. So Americans start drinking Sutter Home White Zin. They immediately roll out of that into another soft and fairly sweet Chardonnay, which is at that time later became real famous as the Kendall Jackson Private Reserve, that lower acid, not so much high alcohol, but a very sweet, very oaky Chardonnay takes over the world. So by the mid 80s, Chardonnay is just getting planted everywhere because it's on fire. Americans can't get enough Chardonnay. They roll right out of Sutter Home White Zin to the soft Chardonnay.
That might have had to do with that Paris tasting too. Remember that there was a Chardonnay. Somebody made the Chardonnay, but it wasn't that style, right?
No, it's not that style at all. So then they go out of that. Then they roll into those Merlots and stuff like that. So they roll into that. So the classically styled wines are made. So there's this huge wave of Chardonnay planting in the 80s, basically, and so then. But a lot of us are sticking to it, especially in the northern Napa Valley, Calistoga, St. Lita, and because the business is good in Cabernet, because we started having great vintages of Cabernet, really 77 and 78. So now it's 5 years after the Paris tasting. It's like 1982, where us and Behringer and we make a bunch of really great Cabernets in 77, 78. This is where it really starts, because 76 super droughty, 75 a little bit wet, 73 and 4 were very wet, didn't really make great wines. But then we get out there's enough of a boom in the American wine market, and we come to market. Napa Valley in general, not just Montelena. That's our first estate cab, is our 78, sold in 82. But Americans are ready for this stuff now because they've heard about the Paris tasting. They're looking for great American wines. And all of a sudden, out of Napa Valley comes these amazing wines, the 78s in particular. And that really shocks the wine world, because man, these wines are great, and they were great. They were almost revolutionary, and what a step up in quality were, because now we have the experience from 72, all those tougher vintages, all the way through 76, 77. We get to 77, 78. All of a sudden, the people know what they're doing. The quality makes not an exponential, but a mathematical jump. It goes up like 25% in quality in 1 year, and it's across the board. Like if you historically look back at these famous tastings where it's, Mondavi Private Reserve or Behringer, pick any one of them, Chateau Montelena. The 78s are fantastic, and that's where we get going. But we're selling those all through the 80s. And so, and then Robert Parker starts in 1986, and the whole, the Wine Spectator takes off. And now that Napa Valley really starts getting the recognition it should have absent prohibition. So these things are all falling into place. It's a kind of a domino thing where the Paris tasting is really the first domino, but then we start making better wines because everybody's interested. The other guys want to win the tasting too. So everybody's trying to make better and better wines. And then we got the technology. We got people like me as an assistant winemaker now in 78. I've been making wine now for 7 harvests. And I'm just the assistant. We got Jerry Looper, he's Free Mark Abbey guy. He's our winemaker. He's got almost 15 years experience making wine. So we have the people and the experience and the dedication where we make these amazing wines. So we all roll through the 80s. And then by the time, and that's when you start seeing the cult wine start because, whether it's the Dalla Valle or, Dick Race or those guys start going. So then you see this next wave of even smaller wineries than the ones, the powerhouse wineries of the 80s. So then we roll into the 90s with the development of the cult wine thing. And that's, total heyday of Robert Parker and Wine Spectator. If you get, good numbers in either one, you're gold, and if you get good numbers from both, you're double gold. It was a great time. And that's co-located in time with amazing 90s. This is unprecedented in the world of wine anywhere where we have 10 great vintages in a row. The weather cooperates 90, 91, 92. I always called it Battleship Row. It was shocking how many great vintages we had in a row. And that's really where Napa Valley takes over the world. And today, nobody really acknowledges it, but that's, to put it in my farmer vernacular, we just kicked their butts. It was.
And it wasn't just obviously one producer, right?
No, it was widespread. Remember, it's
this whole team.
The big wineries get bigger, Behringer gets stronger, and Montelena gets stronger, and then you have whether it's Gustave Dalla Valle and the whole Screaming Eagle effect and that whole thing. It's just like there's just one after another. It's just like this bombardment of great wines coming out of this region, and it was so. It was because we were forced to, that you buy these beautiful properties and you can't build apartments on there. And if I can't build apartments, maybe I should try to make something magnificent. And it did. It drew in that type of people. If you notice the people that moved in at that time, they were all that same kookiness that we all had, that your mom and dad had, like, I'm crazy, I'm going to make something special. And, it's a good crazy.
It's a good crazy. It's a good crazy. Napa Valley, it's a good crazy. It's a... No, it's been amazing to watch that transformation. Initially from me and from my standpoint, I was like, I was born here. At 2 and 5, you start to watch the parents turn 5 in 1970. 7 by 72. By 76, I'm starting to pay attention, and bam, these guys, they won this tasting in Paris. For us, another interesting aspect. 72, same year you started, Nixon goes to China, takes the Schramsberg Blanc de Blanc. For us, as up on our hill, that was a big deal. That was a big deal. That had never happened. There never like a California wine, served at such a significant moment. So we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of that moment this year. And it's happened. It's interesting now that we've started to study that a little bit. I don't have all the data. There's a book that talks about the White House and wine, but we found out very recently that in 1891, some old people here, but no one's that old. But in 1891, at the Palace Hotel in San Francisco, actually, it was a Schramsberger Riesling that was served to then President Benjamin Harrison. And we found out about that not so long ago. That was pretty cool. Which mom and dad knew.
He's got me beat.
Anyhow, so we get into this 90s period. We see some tremendous success. How have things changed since then? What is your lens seen, say, over these last 20 years, and maybe it's time to start thinking a little bit beyond, the present moment as well. But let's first consider the kind of 90s, 2000s, 2010s. interesting details in there that you can think of?
Well, yeah, again, I'm a production guy, so I always look at what's different in our world, where we went from uh, to more precision viticulture, getting the right grape in the right place. And so, after the AXR1 replant, that was the second major replant in Napa Valley. Of course, the 72-4, a lot of people used AXR1, then they had to replant in the AXR1 failure. So that's when the rootstocks all failed, and so we had to replant all the vineyards. So that second planting was better. So now we're into the third planting, and now where I think that Napa Valley is really starting to see the right grape in the right place for your properties or mine, where we really are focused. And the wineries are quite a different design. We're in much smaller batch size, where we're working up to 2 tons. So like our tanks originally would hold 8 tons or 10 tons of cab. Now they hold anywhere from 2 to 15. So you see a lot more precision in the winemaking throughout the industry. Opus One, all their tanks, they were 20-ton design. Everything was set up for 20 tons. Now you go down there, it's not set up for that anymore. So there's been a huge change. The biggest change has been our farming, where we use, actually now we're into using less water than we've ever used before. The irrigation is kind of out of phase now. People are really realizing that you can over irrigate and make whatever. So that's from the production side. Going forward, I do think it's going to develop more like, there's no reason I can think of to see we won't develop a lot along the historical lines of where we should be, absent prohibition, where you see in Bordeaux, for example, is primarily those cultivars, and then Burgundy, those cultivars. I think it'll evolve to the right grape for that individual property is going to go. And I think there'll be somewhere there might be Nero d'Avola or Grenache or something like that instead of Cabernet. Like for me, I have a really hot spot that's way too hot for Cabernet, and for Heidi and my daughter Chelsea, I put in some Grenache in there because I want some sun-baked, really strong Grenache. But then again, that circles back to the art side, not the business, because being a family owned, and we're still growing Zinfandel. Like, what are you, crazy? Zinfandel's, $30 a bottle, and Cabernet is $200 a bottle. What are you screwing around with Zinfandel for? I'm from California. I like Zinfandel.
So it's not all about money, is it?
Yeah,
it's not all about money.
No, when you're family owned, you're not. It can be, but I think I think we're going to see a natural progression, because I think that the ag preserve is here to stay. I think that we are still going to be forced into making earning an honest living off our land and selling the highest value, the most rewarding product you can make from that piece of property. So I think it'll develop a little bit like Bordeaux. I remember my dad used to say, Bordeaux is basically 6 times the size of Napa, and it looks more like Lodi than Napa, that's for sure. But he would say, there's 6,000 wineries in Bordeaux, and only 40 of them make good wine. And I don't think that's going to happen here, but I think the holding capacity of wineries, I think we're about there. I think that I don't see the ability to start a lot more large, significant ones, but I do think that we'll see a little bit of a turn back to people with the backyard wines. I think that the new law where we can have, the little mom and pop guys can have a little tasting room. I don't have a problem with. I've spent a pile of money on our fancy hospitality stuff, but if the guy down the street wants to have a picnic table in his vineyard and sell a couple boxes of wine, that's totally fine with me. I got no problem with that.
It's that notion of the long tail, right? I think if there are only these big or medium-sized brands, and there's no opportunity for the smaller, newer, younger producer to come in with a new idea that might work, I think long-term that can weigh you down. You get weighed down by just the big guys, and so I think it's important that as we go forward, we continue to try to help the newer producer, the newer entrepreneur, whether they grew up here or not, right? They came to Napa, they're interested in making a great wine. Let's make it possible for them to get started.
I do, and I see both. I see the tycoons coming in with limitless budget, and they can spend as much money, and they're actually have their wineries to lose money on a tax dodge. I got no problem with that. But then I also see the dreamers are still starting coming in too. The people like our folks that start small and trying to make something special out of their little corner of the planet that they love. So I just think I think the diversity is going to be good. I think that in the press and stuff, and in the American wholesale system, yeah, we got problems with that, where the domination of the bigs is going to be basically a problem. But back to relationship marketing, how we started, again, because your family was in business. So, for selling wine in the 70s, it was all about a relationship with your restaurant or your customers. Then it went through the really beautiful period with the Wine Spectator and Robert Parker, where you didn't really have to have a relationship anymore because all you were relying on these numbers. Well, that's all retrograde. That's not really the case anymore. And then the internet was great for a couple of years till that turned out to be not trustworthy. And so now, guess what? We're right back to where our folks started. We're back to relationship marketing. So you and I, we have to, travel more than we did in the 80s and 90s and cement our relationship with the people, our fans around the world. It's an interesting situation to have gone almost full circle to where we have to get out and tell our story, because there's a famous wine sales guy in Napa Valley called Louis Strala. And the quote I remember, I believe he was a Robert Mondavi guy. He said, "Any damn fool can make good wine. The genius is in selling."
Absolutely. Don't take it for granted if you make the wine, even if you get the 100-point score, that carries you. You need customers. You need relationships. You need to connect your brand, your ethos, if you will, to people. And it's interesting how during the pandemic we obviously saw a little bit of a change. For a moment, we didn't have visitors. That wasn't easy. For a moment, we didn't have restaurant business either. So that wasn't easy. How did, at your winery, how did you forge through that moment? And what does it look like now here? I don't want to say we're through the pandemic, but I think we're through the part where we're all closed down for the 3 months or whatever it might be.
I think that, like most of the wineries, when people were stuck at home, they just went to the wine shops, and basically we just called it a pivot to retail, that we had a strong enough reputation where we had the demand where we could move the wine to where it would move. And so our fundamental thing was, and the other thing is we have a really robust club department, and they were stuck at home, and man, they bailed us out big time. Their orders went up really high. And so it was our relationship with our club members was a massive success of the winery. And then the pivot to retail really worked out well. For us, actually going to a reservation only in the tasting room because we couldn't get the staff, we're doing a lot more reservation than we ever did before. And that worked out really well. So but the fun part was like taking people and creating jobs, because my whole thing is like, we're most proud of it, I'm sure you are too, is like, we create a good job for over 60 families. We got 68 families counting on us keeping the winery in business. And that's a huge part of my ethos is, again, going back to the Norwegian or the Viking, it's all about the community, as Mike was talking about. It's our community. So for us to keep everybody who wanted to keep working and to reassign guys, it's like we had a lot more carpenters than we ever had before, and painters and rock picker uppers in the vineyard. So, our whole thing is anybody wanted to keep working. So that was the part that I actually ended up enjoying about the pandemic, was working around the government regulations. Like, you got to send people home. I said, but these people got families, they got kids. I don't want to be having them taking free government money. If they want to take free government money, God bless them. But I didn't even do the PPPP. It was a matter of principle, man. So at the end of the day, I think looking back at my career, that I actually think that it was, like the Chinese curse, may live in interesting times. And, we got through it. We had a great crew, and everybody pitched in and did amazing work. And our fans and customers helped us out. So I think it's going to go down as like, it's kind of like one of those, you ever think about a baseball? I use a lot of metaphors. It's not the vintages where it was a walk in the park like 2007. Man, we just crushed it. It was easy. It was easy. No, the ones where it's difficult and you had to make these hard decisions. And those are the games you remember. It's like, it's the bottom of the ninth, 2 outs, and you've got coming up to bat. There's star pitchers in there, and all of a sudden you get a doink over the first baseman's head, and then he steals second, and then you win the game. Those are the ones you remember.
So are you saying that the 2020 vintage Monolina Cabernet, is that the one that we should be collecting? I'm thinking that's what I just heard. Is that accurate?
No, it was the pandemic, not the fire. I feel I have PTSD. I can't drink scotch anymore because it smells too much like smoke.
I see. But it isn't. A couple of thoughts occurred. That notion of creating new jobs, keeping people employed. It was interesting for us. We ended up doing more underbrush clearing in 2020 than we'd ever done before. But for a moment, that was a new job that we had. Fortunately, this was before the fire, and it helped. It helped big time. It's interesting to think if anybody else wants to join the firefighting ranks. I know there are a lot of us that would appreciate more firefighters. The better. Are there some politicians around that might be able to fund more firefighting effort out there? I thought I saw one or two earlier. Maybe we'll just mention that's a good idea. Yeah, but. It's an interesting thought. I mean, we don't want to look at the future with gloom and doom, but obviously, climate is an issue. In 2020, that same year, we had 5 days in St. Helena where I think the high temperature peaked out over 110. That I don't think that had ever happened before that year. Fortunately, it didn't happen in 2021. That was an easier vintage. But so things might change. How as we look at the next 10, 20 years, are we, as we go to plant the next vineyard, are we looking at it through the same lens that we might have looked in 1990, kind of post the new wave of phylloxera? We went back in, and now here we're starting to see more planting going in. Give us a sense for what that notion of planting the vineyard is definitely a decision made about the future, right? We're going to put this vineyard in, and we're going to put it in for 30 years, right, or something like that. So, do you see a change in the way people are thinking about the next vineyard planting compared to where we were 10, 20 years ago?
Sure. Yeah, I think that again, I'm a pretty practical guy. I think that just changing the row orientation to take care of the midday sun and deal with the wind, because here in Napa Valley, basically what our forecast is, if it keeps getting warmer, it's just going to get windier, especially where we are up in Calistoga, because the Russian River breeze is going to blow through more. So we're going to have more afternoon wind. I don't think it'll be like South Africa, Constantia, where it's so windy it affects the bloom, or the Sonoma Coast, where it affects the bloom so much. I'd worry about the wind mostly. The heat, I don't worry too much about that. I think you'll see a little bit go back to the California spot, a little bit less VSP, vertical shoot positioning. I think you're going to see a lot more cross arms again now, the way we farmed when we were young men. So as we had to have the cross arms on the vineyard, as you drive around, you see all those vineyards were just straight down there like that. Okay, that's called VSP, vertical shoot positioning. I think what you're going to see is a lot of people going back to what we saw before with the cross arms on there, and deal with the shade. And so I think we can adapt pretty easily. That most of these cultivars we're growing, Cabernet does like heat. It's where the veg goes out. So in Cabernet, it's his parents are Cabernet Franc Sauv Blanc, so there's all that vegetative character. And part of why Napa Valley really rules the world of Cabernet is it's hot enough here to bake out, and it makes those berry flavors that most Americans really like. So making that American style berry flavored Cabernet instead of that, more herbal Cabernet. I think that's part of been our success. And that has to do with the high heat during the day. So I'm not too worried about the Cabernet, the doom and gloom guys. Oh, it's all over. We're going to grow Nero d'Avola or some Sicilian stuff. I don't buy into that. Again, because you got to remember, I farmed in the 76, 77 drought. So, that little lake at Chateau Montelena, Jade Lake, the Oriental Lake, I've seen that dry twice in my career now. So that was dry in 76, 77 too. So did I think last year was that much worse than 76, 77? Actually, I don't. I see that the weather, it's been probably too stable. That's been our lucky break that we've had. And also with the fires and stuff, if any agricultural commodity in the world, you have from 75 all the way through 2000, you don't have any dud vintages. That's a pretty good run. If you think about any agricultural commodity, whether it's floods in Texas or, tornadoes in Kentucky or wherever the hell you are farming, that to have that run, I think that's what's unusual, that we've had so much stable weather. So I'm really, we're adaptable, we're farmers, and so we'll figure it out when we get there. That's my kind of philosophy at it. It's like, I'm not worried about it. You can only worry about things you can change. If you can't change it, just deal with it.
Amen to that, right? I think it's important to think about, trying to identify those things that we can change, and being willing to accept those things that we can't, right? And that's I tell you what, that might be a good place just to stop right there. And I guess the last part of that is to have the wisdom to be able to tell the difference. I think that's the last part of that. But what a great morning, and to sit here and listen to Bo and to think about Monolena and the success of your family's winery, to think of the how the success of the broader Napa and the industry. And I know as a member of that community for my whole life, we owe a debt of gratitude to you guys. So thank you so much.
All right, thank you. Thanks for all that. Thanks for coming out. Hi to all of our Zoom people, and we're still here.
We're still here.